Far from Home, Portraits of Displacement, written by Gabriel Ndayishimiye. Chapter 3. The Exiled Intellectual. You don't wake up one day and decide to be an exiled intellectual. You don't sit down and plan it out like some kind of career move. It just happens. 1 minute, you're shouting about injustice, and the next, you're on a plane out of the only place you've ever called home, wondering what the hell just happened. You think you'll be back soon. You think it's just a temporary fix until things calm down. Then, a year passes, 5, 10, and it hits you. Home doesn't exist for you anymore. You start calling yourself an intellectual because it's better than calling yourself a runaway. You tell yourself you're still fighting the good fight, still speaking for the ones who can't, still holding the line from the outside. But after a while, you realize you're not speaking for them anymore. You're speaking for whoever's willing to listen. Universities, think tanks, panels that need a face of resilience. People love that word, resilience. They lap it up. They want you to be broken, but not too broken. Hurt, but not bitter. They want you to rise above it. They want your story to mean something so they can feel better about the shit they let happen. You learn to give them what they want. You make your pain sound like it taught you something valuable. You package your suffering like a product and hand it over with a ball on top. And when they call you an exiled intellectual, they mean they like the sound of you. You're safe to listen to because you're far away from the real trouble. You're not a threat anymore. You're just a story they can pass around to feel smarter, to feel like they get it. You're not a problem they have to fix. You're proof that things aren't as bad as they seem. It's not like you chose it. You just slipped into it because it kept you alive. You learned to survive by being useful, by making sense of what they couldn't. You learned to turn your anger into something sharp enough to be respected, but not too sharp to be dangerous. You learned how to make people feel good about your struggle without asking them to change a damn thing. But it eats at you. It gnaws away at your insides because you know it's a lie. Not what you say, but how you say it. You're not a philosopher. You're not a sage. You're just a man who got kicked out and kept talking because silence would have killed you. You write because it's all you have left, and sometimes the words don't even feel like yours. They're shaped by what they want to hear. You hate that you know how to give it to them. And maybe that's the real exile, realizing that your story isn't your own anymore. It belongs to the people who package it up and sell it as proof that the world isn't so bad after all. They want to hear how you survived, not how it broke you. They want to know how you're doing better now, not how the ache never leaves. So you keep talking. You keep writing. You keep playing the part because it's the only way they'll let you speak. And the words pile up on the page like broken glass, sharp and useless, because the only people who really need to hear it aren't listening. But you keep saying it anyway, because it's either that or go quiet. And if you go quiet, they win. You don't run away thinking it's forever. You tell yourself it's just for now, just until things get better. You think you're smart for getting out when you did, when staying meant rotting in a cell or eating a bullet. You think survival is enough, that it'll buy you some kind of redemption later. You never tell yourself you're leaving for good. You just move. Because moving is the only thing left that doesn't feel like giving up. And for a while, you believe it. You hold on to the idea of going back like it's a folded map in your pocket, a little wrinkled but still legible. Maybe a year, maybe 5, just until the smoke clears and the people who wanted you dead are buried or forgotten. You keep the memory of home sharp and neat, like it's something you'll unpack when the time is right. But that's not how it works. Exile doesn't wait for you to catch up. It doesn't let you keep one foot on each side. It's a one-way trip, and you don't even realize it until it's too late to turn around. You get a phone call from someone you used to know, and they talk to you like you're a stranger. They ask you about the weather like you're just another expat with no skin in the game. Or worse, you go back, thinking you'll slip into the old rhythm, like nothing's changed, but everything's different. The streets look the same, but they don't feel the same. The smells are off. The light hits different. The people are cautious around you, like they can smell the foreignness on your skin. You didn't plan on being erased, but that's what it is. You're a ghost in your own story, a memory people tell themselves to feel sad for a minute before moving on. And you realize you've been moving on too. You just didn't notice because you were too busy trying to keep your head above water. But it gets worse. It doesn't just take your place. It doesn't just eat away at the idea of going back. It starts to rot out your voice too. The things you say sound different now. They don't hit like they used to. You tell the same story you've been telling for years, but it doesn't sound like yours anymore. It's been processed, packaged, and printed out as something that fits what people want to hear. You're still talking, but no one's really listening. You're just making noise. And then there's the language. You didn't think that would change. You thought it was the one thing you'd hold on to, the way you'd keep the truth sharp and clean. But it doesn't stay pure. You catch yourself thinking in another language, translating your thoughts just to make them make sense. Your mother tongue starts feeling like a jacket you've outgrown, tight around the shoulders, too short in the sleeves. You say something out loud, and it sounds wrong even to your own ears. Then comes the worst part, the history. You still remember, of course, but your version doesn't count anymore. You left, and the story kept going without you. They rewrote the endings, put new names on the monuments, built new myths to replace the ones you grew up with. You hear people talking about your own country like it's a metaphor, something that happened to other people. You want to shout that they've got it wrong, but no one's interested in the corrections. History belongs to the ones who stayed. You're just a guy with opinions from the outside looking in. And yeah, you can make something out of it. You can shape it into words, turn it into something people clap for at readings or panels. They'll nod and say how powerful it is to hear it firsthand, even though they don't really know what you're talking about. You shape the pain into something that sounds like wisdom, but you know it's just survival. You're not profound. You're just trying to keep from fading out completely. Because that's what exile is in the end. It's not a place. It's a slow erosion. It eats you from the inside out. It takes your home, your voice, your language, and finally your story. It leaves you walking around in the shell of yourself, trying to look solid when the truth is, you're hollow. But what else can you do? You keep moving forward because looking back means breaking. You write it down because it's the only way to remind yourself you're still here, even if the words feel lighter than they should. You keep talking because silence would mean admitting they've won, that they've erased you without leaving a trace. You keep telling the story, even if it doesn't sound like yours anymore, because it's better than having no story at all. You don't get to choose what exile makes of you. You leave, and the leaving changes you. Maybe it breaks you. Maybe it sharpens you. Maybe it turns you into something you don't recognize. You learn to move between places without putting your feet down too hard, like you're afraid the ground might shift and drop you back where you came from. You don't belong anywhere, not really. But you get used to it. You stop thinking about home like it's a place and start thinking about it like it's a habit you kicked a long time ago. After a while, you learn to speak differently. You learn to measure your words because they don't come out the same way they used to. They're too heavy or too light, too angry or too careful. You start shaping them to fit the room you're in, like trying to wedge a sharp thought into a soft space. You get good at it. You get good at making your pain sound like something people can handle without wincing. You make it poetic when you're supposed to, biting when it's safe to be sharp, humble when they want a little humility to balance out the bitterness. You figure out how to live in the gaps between languages, between memories, between versions of yourself that don't talk to each other anymore. You slip between worlds and pretend you belong in both. But you know you don't. Not really. You've become too slippery for any of it to hold on to you. You've learned to survive on scraps and stubbornness, and somehow that feels like freedom, even when it tastes like defeat. But the truth is that freedom isn't given. You take it. You scrape it together from what's left after the world's done breaking you down. You take it because it's the only thing left that doesn't feel like begging. It's the last piece of pride you've got. You don't ask for it. You don't wait for permission. You make it yours because you've learned the hard way that nobody's going to hand it to you wrapped up in a bow. And there's no silence in that. Silence is how they kill you without pulling the trigger. Silence is how they win, how they make sure nobody remembers what they did to you, or why you're still here with fire in your gut. You don't get to go quiet just because it's easier. You don't get to fold up your anger and put it away like it's something you've outgrown. You can't afford that kind of mercy. You keep talking because silence is a slow death, and they're betting on you to give up. At first, you talked like a knife. You thought your rage was enough to make people listen. You thought the truth was like dynamite. Blast it out and watch the world shift around it. But it doesn't work that way. They don't want your truth unless it's polished up and cleaned of its mess. They want tragedy without the blame, pain without the guilt. You learn to sand down the edges so it doesn't cut too deep. Because if you don't, they'll shut the door in your face before you even get a word in. You start saying displacement instead of deportation. You say conflict instead of massacre. You make it sound like a force of nature, something that just happened, not something they did. You watch their eyes relax when you choose the right words, and you hate yourself for knowing how to make it palatable. You hate that you've learned to make your rage sound reasonable because that's the only way they'll listen. But you keep writing. You keep talking. You still tell the story because that's the only weapon you've got left. It's not about getting justice. You're past that. It's about making sure they can't pretend you never existed. You write it down because history has teeth, and it'll eat the truth if you're not careful. You write because giving up would mean handing over the last scrap of yourself they haven't taken. You know you're being used. You know they put you on a stage because it makes them feel generous for listening. You know, they want to clap for you and feel better about themselves without doing a damn thing to change what put you on that stage in the first place. But you don't let it stop you. You know the game. And you know they're hoping you'll tire out and go quiet, but you won't. You can't afford to. Not because you think it'll change anything, but because the only thing worse than speaking and not being heard is not speaking at all. You don't expect them to care. You just refuse to go away. You refuse to let them forget that you were here, that you saw it all, that you've got the words to make it hurt if you have to. It's not redemption. It's not triumph. It's just surviving with your voice intact. And if that's the only victory left, you'll take it. Because you know what happens when you stop talking. They win. They erase you. And the truth goes with you. And you'll be damned if you let that happen. There are things you don't say. Not because you're scared, but because some truths are too damn heavy for the world to carry. You can't just dump them on the page and expect people to pick them up without breaking something. They're too raw, too bitter, too full of fire to fit neatly into a speech or a book. Those are the truths that don't leave you alone. The ones that gnaw at your gut when the room's gone quiet. They're not the kind you lay out for strangers to poke at like curiosities. They belong to the people who lived them, the ones who already know, who don't need you to explain it. Sometimes you wonder what would happen if you just stopped talking altogether, if you let the words dry up and gave up on the whole damn thing. Maybe you just melt into the background, vanish like a footprint washed away by the tide. Maybe someone else would step in, say the things you didn't, carry the load for a while. Or maybe it'd all go silent, like you'd never been there at all. Just one more voice gone quiet, one more story left to rot in the dark. But that's the thing that keeps you talking. This fear of being erased. It's not about changing the world or waking people up. You're not that naive anymore. It's about making sure you don't disappear without leaving a mark. You don't write because you expect justice or because you believe your words will be heard. You write because silence is surrender, and you're too damn stubborn to go down without a fight. You think about home sometimes, about what it even means anymore. Did you lose your land, or just the idea of it? Home is supposed to be where you can let your guard down, but that place doesn't exist anymore. Not really. It's just a ghost that sits in the back of your mind and whispers to you in the dark. The streets you knew have changed, the people too. Maybe it was always like that, and you just didn't see it. Nostalgia's a liar, but it's all you've got left. Anger doesn't explode like it used to. It sits low, like a wolf curled up in your gut, waiting for something to snap. You don't blame the ones who stayed. Not really. You're just mad at yourself for not holding on tighter, for not fighting harder, for losing ground you should have kept. Sometimes you wonder if home was ever really yours, or just something you made up to make the loss bearable. Home shifts around in your head. You remember it one way, clean and familiar, like a photograph untouched by time. But the more you stay away, the more that image cracks and blurs. It's not about accuracy anymore. It's about holding on to something so it doesn't slip away completely. You still dream in your first language, but the words come out bent and broken, like they've been chewed up and spat back out. Sometimes the words slip away altogether. And that scares you more than anything. You haven't forgotten. But remembering wrong feels like betrayal. You can't figure out if you long for home or hate it. Sometimes it's both at once. You think about it when a song drifts through an open window, or when the smell of some familiar spice hits you on the street. But it doesn't feel good. It just makes the ache sharper. You know that home isn't just where you came from. It's the place that pushed you out, that made sure you didn't belong anymore. How do you love a place that didn't fight to keep you? And the ones who stayed, they're the real survivors. They didn't get a choice. They adapted. They made something out of the wreckage. They look at you now like you're some kind of outsider, one of them, but not really. You can't go back and expect to just slide into the life you left behind. You're a stranger now, and they can't see you without thinking of how you left. It used to be easy to think you were speaking for the ones you left behind, that your words meant something, that writing about the loss and the wreckage made it count for something. But you know better now. The people back home don't read you. They don't hear you. They don't claim you. You belong to someone else now. Academics, journalists, foreign policy wonks who use your words like wallpaper in a conference room. You're an important voice, whatever the hell that means. But the ones you're supposed to be speaking for, they've moved on without you. Sometimes, when you write, you picture someone back home reading it, someone who remembers you, who knows what you're talking about without needing it dressed up and translated. But you know that person doesn't exist. The people you thought you were fighting for don't recognize you anymore. You've gone Western, people say. You see the world through foreign eyes. Maybe it's true. Maybe exile has twisted your perspective into something that doesn't fit anywhere. And yet, there's still guilt gnawing at you, the guilt of being heard when the ones who stayed behind are still stuck in the same old silence. How do you balance the privilege of being given a platform with the knowledge that others are buried under the weight of the same story? You wonder if you've betrayed something sacred, if you've turned your country's suffering into a currency you can't stop spending. You wonder if your story still belongs to you, or if it's been carved up and handed out to whoever needs a neat narrative of loss and redemption. Sometimes you wonder if staying would have meant losing your voice altogether, if speaking at all meant leaving behind the people who needed you most. Maybe exile saved your voice, even as it took away your place. Maybe the real loss wasn't home. It was the right to speak in the language of those who stayed behind, the right to say we without sounding like an outsider. And you ask yourself the same damn question over and over. If you had stayed, would you have been able to speak at all? Or would your words have been swallowed up before they even hit the air? Maybe leaving was the only way to keep talking. Maybe Exile saved your voice, but killed your belonging. Maybe that's the final betrayal. Speaking from a place where the ones you loved can't hear you anymore. And every time you write, you're not sure if it's an act of resistance or just a way of keeping the guilt from eating you alive. Would you have been able to write it down at all if you had stayed? Or would your words have dried up before they even reached the page, swallowed by the silence that cloaks itself as caution, as survival, as staying alive? Maybe exile saved your voice, even as it cut you off from the ones you swore you were speaking for. Maybe that's the real cruelty. The way displacement doesn't just take your home, but robs you of the right to say we instead of they. You wonder if you're even speaking because you want to, or because someone needs your story to sell. Somewhere along the line, it stopped being yours. Someone took it and dressed it up, trimmed the fat, polished the rough parts, made it digestible. They didn't want your rage. They wanted your resilience. They didn't want your anger, just your suffering, cleaned up, edited down, something that made people feel noble for listening. You didn't mean to lose control of it. It just happened, bit by bit. A quote here, a headline there. The sad parts caught on because they made people feel good about feeling bad. But the fire and the fury, they didn't want that. They wanted to hear how you survived, not what broke you to begin with. Now, it's out of your hands. Your story scattered and reshaped into something that barely looks like you anymore. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to whoever needs it to prop up their sense of righteousness. Maybe you noticed it slipping away, but by the time you did, it was too late to take it back. You can't wrestle your own voice out of the hands of 1,000 people who think they own it now. You needed the platform just to stay visible, just to keep from being buried under the weight of indifference. But the platform came with strings, and now the story isn't really yours anymore. It's the version they like, the one that hurts just enough to tug at the conscience, but never enough to make anyone uncomfortable. You keep speaking, but it doesn't feel real anymore. You're just playing the part now, sticking to the lines they wrote for you. Because if you stop, you disappear. That's the ugly truth. They don't want the whole story, just the pieces they can handle without choking on it. And that's how you lose your voice without ever going quiet. You get the invitations to speak, to write, to sit on panels where the word exile is pronounced with polished syllables and respectable concern. They introduce you as a refugee writer, an exiled intellectual, a voice of resilience. And you know before you even open your mouth what they're expecting from you. You have to be reasonable. You have to be measured. You have to be grateful. They let you critique, but only in ways that don't make anyone squirm. You can talk about your suffering, but you can't rage about it. You can hint at injustice, but don't point fingers. Describe what was done to you, but keep it vague. Keep it abstract. Never name the ones who did it. You've learned to tone down your anger, not because you want to, but because you know how quickly doors close on the ones who don't follow the script. You've seen what happens when exiles refuse to be polite. You've watched writers uninvited, grants revoked, careers quietly dismantled. The exiles who rage, who refuse to perform the right kind of suffering, they get erased without a sound. You learn to soften your words because you know the cost of speaking too clearly. You know your platform is conditional. and you've been careful not to lose it. But every now and then, you think about throwing it all away, just saying it like it is. No soft edges, no apologies, no diplomacy. You wonder if your words would finally carry weight, or if they just vanish, buried under the silence that follows when you're no longer useful. You've seen it before. That shift in the room when you go too far, when your words get a little too sharp. You notice the sideways glances, the uneasy clearing of throats, the way a moderator tries to smooth it over, move the conversation to safer ground. Later, when the invitations stop coming, no one tells you why. There's no warning, just silence. Your proposals go unanswered, your funding slips through your fingers, and you know why. You went too far. You stopped being manageable. You started telling the truth without making it pretty. They liked you better when your suffering was poetic. When it served a narrative, they could pat themselves on the back for understanding. They didn't want to hear that the systems that made you run are the same ones they fund, the same ones they profit from. You stopped playing nice, and they moved on to the next palatable voice. The country that took you in loves to call itself a sanctuary. It talks about freedom like it invented the concept, drapes itself in words like justice and rights. It gives speeches about dignity while signing contracts for weapons and building walls. For a while you tried to believe it, that you'd been saved, that you'd been chosen, that they gave you a second life out of some sense of justice. But the longer you stayed, the more it hit you. This place is just another machine of exile. They didn't just open their doors to you, they helped kick you out of your own home. They destabilized your country, funded the chaos, armed the hands that burned down your city. And now they want to be praised for offering you a bed and a passport. It's a joke, a cruel, twisted joke. They want gratitude, not accountability. They want to feel good about saving you without ever admitting they had a hand in your ruin. You've felt that pressure to perform gratitude before, the expectation that you should just be thankful for what you've been given. As if safety isn't a right, but a privilege they've extended, conditioned on your silence, your compliance, your willingness to be the good refugee. They like your story as long as it doesn't make them uncomfortable. They'll keep you safe as long as you don't remind them why you had to leave in the first place. And you know that safety isn't permanent. One election, one policy change, one crisis where they need a scapegoat. Suddenly, the welcome mat's gone and you're just another foreign problem. You're never really safe, not anywhere. That's the real truth of exile. They like the story when it's wrapped up neat, pain softened, suffering packaged with a bow on it. They'll listen as long as it makes them feel good about themselves, as long as it fits the narrative that they're helping. But when the story gets too real, too raw, too angry, they turn away. They don't want to know that survival is messy, that some days it's just stubbornness keeping you upright. You know that if you tell the truth too loud, they'll call you ungrateful. They'll say you're bitter, that you're too negative, that your story doesn't uplift. They'll find someone else who knows how to make exile sound poetic and brave. Someone who doesn't make them squirm. You've seen it happen. You know how power works, how it pushes the inconvenient to the margins and lifts up the voices that make suffering sound noble. You know how easily they'll let you fade into silence when you stop giving them what they want. You wonder if speaking the whole truth would finally make a difference, or if it would just make you disappear, one more exile erased from memory. And you tell yourself that if it comes to that, you'll speak anyway, because losing your voice is worse than losing your place, because the silence is the real enemy, the quiet that swallows everything real and leaves behind nothing but the lies people can live with. You know how power works when you're in exile. It doesn't come for you with guns and chains. It just lets you fade. It doesn't drag you away. It just makes sure your words don't travel. It doesn't silence you. It lets you keep talking, just loud enough that no one hears. You get to speak all you want, and no one stops you. But the world keeps moving like you're not even there. That's how they do it now. Erase you without lifting a finger. It's a different kind of exile, being cut off not from home, but from relevance itself. It's the exile of being unheard, of words falling into an empty room, of people who used to listen finding something easier to nod along to. Your ideas start to feel brittle, like they've been left out in the cold too long. You wonder which one hurts more, the exile that put a border between you and your land, or the exile that makes you invisible to the very people who once claimed to need your voice. For the longest time, you thought exile was just something that happened, a consequence of being in the wrong place, of living in a state that collapsed on itself, of saying the wrong thing too loud. You thought it was a side effect, just fallout from disaster. But it's not. Exile is deliberate. It's a tool. It's not just a wound. It's a weapon. The intellectuals, the dissidents, the critics, they aren't just lost. They're removed. It's not some tragic accident of history. It's how power clears the field, sweeps away the inconvenient voices far enough that they're no longer a threat. When you look back, you see exactly who benefits. The land doesn't stay empty. It gets taken. Your home, your place of thought, your university, your street, they get repurposed. The regime that cast you out rewrites history without anyone left to challenge it. The ideas you fought for are absorbed or erased. The very institutions that once fostered critical thought become compliant, obedient, hushed. And out here in the West, they're happy to take you in, but only in fragments. You don't get to be a whole person. You're just a refugee success story, a dissident who made it out, a scholar with a safe space to criticize from a distance. You're not seen as a threat anymore because you're useful now. They lift you up as proof of their generosity without ever acknowledging that they're just as responsible for the mess you fled. You wonder sometimes, what if every exiled intellectual returned at once? What if exile didn't scatter people, but brought them together, made them a force that couldn't be ignored? If you all showed up at the same time, back in the places that threw you out, would the systems that displaced you still stand? Would the institutions that took your place still be seen as legitimate? But the truth is, they don't want you to return. They'd rather keep you scattered, fragmented, dependent on foreign platforms, grateful for any space you're given. You're easier to handle this way, easier to ignore when you stop playing your part. They know as long as you're abroad, as long as you're seen through the lens of the outsider, your words can be celebrated without causing too much trouble. That's the question that stays stuck in your throat. Did exile make you stronger or just more useful? Not to your people, not to the ones still waiting back home, but to those who profit from suffering, those who manage displacement like it's just another problem to be solved. You wonder if you've become just another tool in the hands of the same systems that forced you out in the first place. You used to think you'd return someday. You spoke about it like it was inevitable, as if exile was just a long detour. You carried that idea of return like a folded map in your pocket, always ready to unfold. But as the years passed, the map got blurry. The roads changed. The landmarks faded. That place you longed for became more memory than reality. At some point, without really deciding, you stopped pretending you could go back. You still write about it, still talk about home like it's something real and sacred. But do you believe it? Or has exile hardened into an identity, a permanent state you just can't shake off? Maybe going back wouldn't fix anything. Maybe it would just make the rupture more real, prove that what you lost can't be regained. If you could return, if exile ended, what would it even look like? It would take more than just you walking back through the door. It would take dismantling the whole system that made exile possible. The wars, the power grabs, the borders drawn like scars on a map. It would take undoing centuries of violence, of seeing people as disposable. You know that world isn't coming anytime soon, so you keep preparing. But for what? Resistance? Or just the slow work of documenting loss, keeping track of everything slipping away? And when you dream, where are you? Still moving, still writing, or finally home? You don't know. Maybe exile never really ends. Maybe it just follows you, even if you get back. Maybe home isn't a place anymore, but a question you'll spend the rest of your life trying to answer. For so long, you've been defined by what was taken from you, by the gap between the person you were and the one exile made you into. It was supposed to be a chapter, but it swallowed the whole story. Your name is always tagged with it: exiled writer, displaced thinker, refugee intellectual. It's how they introduce you, how they see you. But are you more than that? You want to believe so. You want to believe you're more than just your absence, more than the history that keeps its claws in you. You want to believe survival isn't the end of the story, that you're more than just a witness to loss, more than the living proof of displacement. Can you imagine yourself beyond it, beyond survival, beyond resistance? If you were really free, free from borders, free from history, who would you be? You don't know. Maybe no exile ever really does. Maybe freedom isn't about return or justice or even acceptance. Maybe it's just the right to exist without having to explain yourself. To be more than just a testimony, more than a story of what was broken. Strip away the exile, the fight, the pride that keeps you standing. What's left? Just a person, tired, scarred, a little bitter from being pushed around too much, a little quieter because talking too much means losing something. You don't know who you are anymore. You're just trying to make it to tomorrow. That's all there is. Just someone hanging on. Nothing noble, nothing grand. Just stubborn enough to keep going because stopping isn't an option. And so you keep writing. Not because you want to, not because it feels good, but because the words are all you've got left. You sit there, staring at the blank page like it's the last enemy you've got to beat. You don't shape it or plan it. You just let it bleed out. You write, because silence isn't something you can afford. You write because it's the only way you know how to keep the loneliness from swallowing you whole. You keep speaking because losing your voice is worse than losing your place. You keep shouting into the void because you refuse to let them forget you exist. You don't speak because you think you'll change the world. You speak because silence is surrender. You write because it's the only fight you've got left. You don't get to decide how this ends. Not really. You don't get to wrap it up neat and tidy with some moral stuck on like a ribbon. Exile doesn't resolve itself. It just lingers, stretching out like a shadow that won't stay put. You keep moving, and it just follows, never far behind, never letting you forget. You keep writing because it's the only thing you know how to do. You write down the loss, the anger, the confusion, the endless feeling of being untethered from everything that once held you steady. You write about what it's like to belong nowhere, to be a ghost haunting two places at once, the home you left and the country that doesn't know what to do with you. You write because speaking is the only way to claw back a piece of yourself from the void. You don't know if it'll make any difference. Maybe your words will outlast you, or maybe they'll get swallowed up like so many others before. Maybe the ones who come after will pick them up, piece together what you tried to say, make sense of the mess you left behind. Or maybe they'll read it and feel nothing at all. You can't control that. You just keep telling it like it is, because it's the only thing you've got. You used to think you'd get back. That exile was a temporary state, a bridge between one life and another. You used to believe you'd step back into that old life, pick up where you left off, and everything would make sense again. But you know better now. The idea of return was just something to cling to when you didn't know how to survive without it. Now you understand. Return isn't going back to what you had. It's confronting how much you've changed and how much you've lost. And if you did go back, what would be waiting? A place that's moved on without you. A version of yourself that no longer fits. You wouldn't recognize it, and it wouldn't recognize you. So you keep moving forward, even when it feels like trudging through mud. You write, even when it feels pointless, because you refuse to be silenced. You refuse to be erased. You'll keep telling the story because it's yours, and no one else is going to do it right. Maybe someday someone will read your words and feel the weight of them, the anger, the ache, the stubborn refusal to just disappear. Maybe they'll see that exile isn't just a loss, but a fight to stay human in the face of displacement. Maybe they'll understand that survival isn't victory. It's just not dying. And maybe that's enough. You close your notebook and lean back, staring at the ceiling like it might have an answer. The city hums around you, indifferent and busy, and you're just one more lost soul trying to make sense of the fragments. You're still here, still breathing, still speaking, and for now that's enough.